The war chief wanted their blood, and he said so to my face in my own hall. They cannot pay, my king. Bram Halloran spread the tally on the long table where 3 generations of my line had settled debts and marriages and wars. Fenn's Reach owes 1,100 head of grain, 40 of iron, and the price of the 6 wolves they let the Rusk kill at their stretch of the border. They have nothing, so we take the valley itself, the men to labor, the rest turned out. Let it be a lesson the whole coast can read. Behind him, the delegation from that starving valley stood in their travel mud. 7 farmers and an old headman who had come to Kelvar, knowing they came to beg. The sea threw itself against the cliffs below the hall. The salt of it lived in the stone, in the fire smoke, in every breath I had ever taken. I was born in this hold. I had buried my father in it, and my mother, and a war's worth of my own wolves in the black ground above the tide line. I had no mate to bury and no mate to hold. At 38 winters I had stopped waiting for the moon to send me one. A king does not get everything a man wants, and I had made a kind of peace with the getting of nothing. You would turn out children in winter to teach the coast a lesson, I said. I would keep the other valleys paying. Bram was not a cruel man, only a practical one, and practical men do the coldest things and call it sense. Mercy at Fenn's Reach is a bill the next debtor sends us. Forgive 1 valley, and by spring there will be 9 that suddenly cannot find their grain. He was not wrong, and that was the trouble with Bram. He was seldom wrong about the arithmetic of a thing, and never right about the cost of it. I had known him since we were both pups scrapping on the same floor, and he had stood at my shoulder through the whole long war with the North Isle raiders, and there was no wolf on the Iron Coast I would sooner have at my back with a blade. But he read the world like a ledger, and some things a ledger cannot hold. The headman's hands shook on his hat. He opened his mouth to plead, and I already knew the shape of what he would say, because desperate men in that hall always said the same thing: mercy, great king, the children, the winter, we will make it good, and I was tired down to the marrow of being the reason for it. I had ruled Kelvar for 12 years, and I had grown into a man whose own farmers came to him white-faced, rehearsing their begging on the road. I did not like what that had made me. I liked it less by the year. We can pay, a woman said. She had stood so still at the back of the delegation that I had taken her for a servant sent to carry the tally sticks. Now she stepped past the farmers and into the firelight, and I saw her properly for the first time. A plain gray dress mended at both cuffs, dark hair bound back off a face that was neither soft nor hard, but only steady. A steadiness I had not seen in that hall in years. She was not beautiful the way the court women were beautiful, all silver and studied and cold. She was beautiful the way a lit window is beautiful to a man who has been out too long in the dark and the weather not for itself, but for what it promises: warmth, and someone awake inside, and a door. And when she spoke, the tide in my blood turned toward her. I have no better way to say it, and I have tried in the years since to find one. All my life the sea has been a sound outside me, waves, wind, the long drag of the water going out over the shingle at the ebb. When she said we can pay, the sea moved inside me. Some deep water I had never known was there, turning slowly, wholly in her direction, the way the whole ocean leans toward the moon whether it wills to or not. My hand closed hard on the arm of my chair. I said nothing, and I let nothing cross my face, because a king who has been alone as long as I had does not trust the first warmth he feels. He suspects it, the way you suspect a fire in a house that has no business having one, and goes looking for who lit it and why. With what? Bram said, not troubling to make it a question. With me. She kept her eyes on me, not on him, and that took a courage I did not credit until later, because Bram was a large and famous killer and I was said to be worse. You want a lesson the coast can read, war chief. Turning out farmers reads as cruelty, and cruelty makes men brave and stupid. The next valley won't send you grain, it'll send you knives in the dark. But a valley that could not pay its debt in coin, and paid it instead by giving its own daughter to the king's own house, that reads as loyalty rewarded. That's the lesson that keeps the coast paying without a war. She drew a breath, and I saw her hands were not steady at all, and admired her the more for the steady voice she kept over them. Wed me. Bind Fenn's reach to Kelvar by blood instead of by chains. Forgive the debt as a bride price. My people plan again in spring, and the whole coast sees a king who takes wives, not slaves. The hall had gone very quiet. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath at the turn of the tide. You would sell yourself, Bram said, and there was something like disgust in it, though whether at her or at me or at the whole business I couldn't tell. I would spend myself, she answered. There's a difference, and you'd know it if you'd ever in your life had less than you needed. She looked at me again, and again only at me. I'm Sorcha. My mother kept the mill at Fenn's Reach before the flood took the wheel and her health after it. I can read, I can reckon a ledger cleaner than your steward. I can set a bone and birth a lamb and hold my tongue in a room full of men who want me to be afraid. I'm not offering you a pretty thing to look at, my king. I'm offering you a useful wife and a peace that costs your treasury nothing but a burned tally. A pause. You may say no. Kings do. But say it to me, to my face, not to a hall full of my neighbors who walked 4 days in the cold to watch me fail. I should have said no. It was a hostage match dressed as a mercy. I knew it, Bram knew it, and if I had any decency at all I would have forgiven the debt outright and sent her home unpurchased and unbound. That is the man I wished I were, standing there with the strange new tide turning in my blood, and this plain gray woman looking at me as if she had already reckoned my answer and priced her own dignity to survive it. Instead I heard myself say, the debt is forgiven whether you wed me or not. Go home to your valley, Sorcha of Fenn's Reach. You owe me nothing, and I'll not buy a wife off a tally sheet. I meant it kindly. I meant it as the one clean thing in a dirty business, and I watched something break behind her steadiness, not relief. Fear. Real fear, the first she had shown. She had a reason to want this that had nothing to do with the debt, and I had just taken it from her without knowing what it was, and set her back on the road to whatever she had walked 4 days to escape. Then I ask it as a favor, she said, very low, so low that only I and the fire could hear it. Let me stay. I'll earn it. I'll not be a burden on your house a single day. I've nowhere in that valley that's mine anymore, and the road home is worse than the road here. And then louder for the room, gathering the steadiness back around her like a cloak. A king who forgives a debt and takes a willing wife is twice the king who does either alone. Let the coast tell that story. Bram laughed once, short and hard. The headman was weeping openly now, into his hat, and would not lift his face. And I understood slowly, the way you understand a thing your gut has known for a while, that whatever waited for Sorcha back in Fenn's Reach, these men had let her walk into my hall to escape it, and were ashamed of themselves for it, and glad past shame that a road out had opened, even a road that ran through the bed of a king they'd been taught to fear. Stay then, I said, but hear the terms and hear them witnessed, not as a hostage, not as a purchase, not as a debt in a woman's shape. The words came from somewhere deeper than my sense, some place the new tide had loosened, as my betrothed from this night to the turn of the moon. And if either of us wishes to end it at the moon turn, it ends with no debt, no dishonor, and no chain on either side. Bram, the tally is burned. Whatever Sorcha chooses, Fenn's Reach owes the coast nothing after tonight but its own spring planting. My war chief looked at me as if I had lost my mind, and perhaps I had. A king does not throw away 1,100 head of grain on a plain girl's steady voice. But he threw the tally sticks in the fire, one by one, because I was his king and he was, under all the arithmetic, a loyal man, and each little flare lit Sorcha's face as it caught. And I thought, watching her watch her people's ruin turn to ash, I will regret this, and I do not care, and I have not felt anything worth regretting in a very long time. The court hated her within a day. I had expected as much. Kelvar's great families had spent 2 years steering their daughters and nieces and wards across my path like ships tacking for harbor, and Lady Sabeth Pharaoh chief among them, silver-haired, quick-witted, the most eligible she-wolf on the Iron Coast, mistress of the second richest hold on the whole northern water. And until that night at the tally table, the woman my council had all but decided I would wed by the year's end. Sabeth was not a fool, and she did not make a fool's mistakes. She did not sneer at Sorcha where I could see it. She did not need to. She simply arranged the hold, with a hostess's flawless smiling care, so that a valley girl who could not dance the coast measures, did not know which knife drew which course, and owned exactly one gray dress would be reminded of it 100 small times a day in front of everyone, and never once given a thing to protest that would not make her look sour and low for protesting it. Sorcha bore it without a single complaint to me, which somehow shamed me more than any complaint could have. I would come upon her sometimes at the edge of a feast, seated below the salt where Sabeth's careful seating always put her, watching the dancing with a face of such composed attention that a stranger would have thought her content, and only I, who had begun without meaning to learn her face, could see the cost of the composure underneath. She never let them see it. She saved it, I think, for the dark and the kennel. Because it was the kennel she went to. I learned that within the first week. I watched her those first days, the way you watch whether you don't yet trust from a distance, ready to be wrong. And what I saw was this. She rose before the kitchens, before the first gray line came up over the sea. She learned the name of every servant in the hold before she learned the name of a single lord, the scullery boys, the old woman who did the mending, the lame man who tended the hall fires and whom the court walked past as if he were furniture. She learned their names and their children's names and which of them had a bad hip and which a bad husband, and she carried water and mended her own cuffs and asked for nothing, and the below stairs of Kelvar, which misses nothing and forgives less, decided within a fortnight that whatever the great families upstairs thought, the valley girl was one of theirs. And then there was Call. Old Farron the kennel master kept the pack's wolves, the true wolves, the great gray beasts that run with us and are not us, that the old blood of the coast has bred and hunted beside since before there were kings. Call was the oldest and the worst of them, a gray brute the size of a yearling colt, who had let no hand but Farron's near him in 9 years, and who had taken a boar's tusk in the flank that autumn deep and dirty. The wound festered and would not close. 3 healers had been to him. 2 he had driven off snapping. The 3rd had looked at the black edges of it and shaken his head and told Farron gently that it was a mercy owed now, not a healing, and that he would come back with the quiet draft at week's end. I found Sorcha in the kennel the night before that week's end, and I found her there because I could not sleep and had gone down to sit with the old wolf myself, meaning to be the hand that gave Farron leave. And instead there she was, in the straw and the cold, in her one gray dress with the cuffs freshly mended, and Call's great ruined head was in her lap. I stopped in the doorway. I did not speak. Call's eyes rolled toward me, and a growl started low in his chest, and Sorcha's hand moved on his ruff, not hard, just there, and the growl folded down into nothing, and the old wolf let his head sink back into her lap and watched me the way a dog watches a stranger it has decided not to bother with because its own person has judged him safe. She had a basin of seawater at her side, gone pink, and clean linen torn in strips, and she was cleaning the wound 3 healers would not touch, with a patience that had no bottom to it, singing under her breath, low, some valley tune with no grand words in it. The kind of song you sing to a frightened child at the far end of a long night when you are past pretending anything but that you will stay. Farron let you in here, I said at last, keeping my voice low. Farron gave up on him. She did not look at me, so there was no one to say no. She wrung out a strip of linen. The rot's only at the surface, my king. The healers wouldn't get close enough to see it. Deep muscles clean. It's the skin that's died, and dead skin has to come away or it poisons the live flesh under it. It hurts him worse than the wound to take it off, so he fights, so no one will, so it spreads, so they call it hopeless. It isn't hopeless. It's just slow and it hurts, and no one had the 2 nights it wanted. She glanced up then, finally, and there was no self-pity in her face and no bid for praise, only a plain fact laid on the table. I had the 2 nights. I don't sleep much here. I don't sleep much here. She said it as she'd have said the tide was out, a condition of the place, not a grief to be soothed. And I understood, standing there, that I had let a woman who could not sleep in my house go 2 nights into a cold kennel to save a dying wolf no one else would touch, because it was the only place in Kelvar where nothing was asked of her but patience, which she had in a measure I have never seen in another living soul. I sat down in the straw across from her. I, the Alpha King of the Iron Coast, sat in the muck of my own kennel in the middle of the night, and I said, "Then take the 3rd night with 2 of us at it. Tell me what to do." She looked at me a long moment. Then she showed me how to hold the old wolf's head so the pain in his flank had somewhere to go that wasn't fighting, how to keep the seawater warm against the cold, when to press and when only to wait. And we did it together, the king and the valley girl and the dying wolf, until the gray line came up over the sea, and by the dawn call's tail moved once against the straw, weakly, a small gray flag of surrender to living. By the week's end, the week Farron had meant to end with a draft. The old brute followed her the length of the hold, and the whole pack that had watched her arrival with flat suspicion began, one by one, and then all at once, to watch her the way wolves watch someone they have quietly decided is theirs and will be defending henceforth. "You have a way with wounded things," I said to her, some cold dawn after, finding her in the kennel again with Call's great head in her lap and her back against the warm stone. "I have a way with waiting," she said, not looking up. "It's the same thing mostly. A wounded thing is only frightened. You sit with it long enough that being near you costs it nothing. You don't grab, you don't hurry, you don't need anything back, and then, on its own, it lets you close. You can't heal a thing you're chasing." She scratched Call's ruined ear, and the old wolf groaned with pleasure. "People are the same. They just take longer than wolves, and they lie about it the whole way." I did not know what to say to that, so I said the wrong thing, the thing I had been carrying since the tally table like a stone in my boot. "You had a reason to leave your valley, not the debt. Something waiting for you there worse than a king who might turn you out." Her hand went still on the wolf's fur. For a long moment I thought she would not answer, and I had half decided I had no right to make her, when she began, evenly, as if reading it off a page she'd read many times before, which is how people speak of the things that have hurt them longest. "My mother kept the mill till the flood," she said. "When the wheel went, so did the living, and when the living went, so did her health. She coughed 3 winters, and then she was gone, and I was 17 and unwed, so I passed to my uncle, her brother, the way a chair passes, or a debt. He wasn't a wicked man in the loud way. He was worse in the quiet one. He looked at a girl the way your war chief looks at a tally, what's she worth, who will take her, what does it settle, and he found a man for me. A friend of his, older, with land above the flood line and 2 wives already in the ground above it. She wrung a strip of linen she did not need to wring. I saw what he was the first time I went to that house, not in how he was to me, he was smooth enough to me, in how he was to his hounds, and to the graves of the 2 who'd gone before, which he'd not troubled to mark. A man tells you everything about himself in how he treats the things that can't answer him back. She looked up at me then, and there was steel under the steadiness, the first I'd seen of it. "When your war chief's summons came for the debt party, my uncle meant to have me wed before the snow closed the roads. So when they needed a body to make the party look proper, I begged to be sent, a valley girl in the delegation, to soften the king's heart, they said. My uncle thought I'd shame myself and come home ready to take the older man out of gratitude for a roof, a breath. I never meant to come home." The tide moved in me again, harder than in the hall, and this time I understood it fully for what it was, and the understanding frightened me more than any war ever had. Because she was my fated mate. I had felt it at her first word, and I had spent a week learning her face, and I no longer had any way to pretend otherwise to myself. The moon had bound me to this plain, patient, unbreakable woman before I knew her name, and every wolf on the coast would call it the greatest fortune a king could have. And I could not tell her. If I told her, "You are my fated mate, the moon has bound me to you," I felt it the instant you spoke. Then everything she did from that hour would be poisoned by the question. Had she come to love me, or had the bond made her? Had she stayed for me, or because a fated woman finds it hard past bearing to walk away from the wolf she's tied to? I had watched exactly that question rot a marriage in my own house, my father's second wife. A good woman, bound to him by the moon and driven half to madness over the years, wondering whether a single warm feeling she'd ever had for him was truly her own, or only the tide in her blood wearing the mask of a choice. She died still asking it. I would not do that to a woman who had already been passed like a chair, already been priced by an uncle, already been nearly sold to a man who did not mark his dead. A woman who had walked 4 days into the house of a king she feared for the one thing she had never once been given. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than any battle, and I have fought a war. I said nothing about the bond. And I set myself, from that dawn in the kennel, to give her the one thing no one had ever thought to give her, a door that opened outward. When the moon turns, I told her, not that dawn, but a few days after, choosing my ground, choosing an hour when no one could overhear and mistake it for weakness. You may go. And I don't mean turned out and shamed. I mean gone as a free and landed woman. The debt is forgiven, that's done, that's ash. And I'll settle on you from my own hand and not the treasuries, land of your own above any floodline ever reckoned, and coin enough to work it. And it will be yours, married to no man, owned by no uncle, beholden to no king. You could go home to Fens, reach the richest woman in the valley, and answer to no one for the rest of your life. She had gone very still, the way she went still. We were on the seawall in the early light, the wind off the water pulling at her gray dress, and Call pacing the wall behind us with his new devotion. Or, I said, and here my voice was not as steady as I'd meant it to be, you may stay and wed me and be Luna of the Iron Coast, which is a colder and a harder life than the land I'm offering you, in a hall full of Sabbath pharaohs who will not warm to you in a hurry. I'll not pretend it's the sweeter bargain. It isn't. I made myself say the rest. But hear me plainly, Sorcha, because I think no one ever has said it to you plainly. I'll not have you wed me out of gratitude that I burned a tally. I'll not have you wed me out of fear of that man above the flood line, or that uncle, or the road home. And I'll not have you wed me because a valley girl believes down in her bones that she cannot say no to a king. So I'm telling you, you can already say no. You are free from this hour, whatever comes at the moon turn. Whatever you choose, choose it as a woman who owes me nothing and fears me not at all. She stared at me, and for the first time since she'd walked into my hall, her steadiness cracked all the way through, not into tears, not yet, but into something rawer. The face of a woman who has never once in her whole life been handed a door that opened out, and does not, at first, know what it is she's looking at, or trust that it's real, or believe it won't be snatched back the instant she reaches for it. Why, she said, not a question of reasons, a question of why would anyone? Because you deserve to want it, I said, or to not want it, and you've never once been let to do either. That's all. That's the whole of it. She turned and looked at the sea for a long time, and I let her, because I had learned by then that Sorcha did her deciding in silence, and that a man who filled the silence would only get a decision made to be rid of him. Call came and put his great head against her hip. At last she said, without turning, "You're a strange king." "So I'm told. The stories on the coast have you a monster." "The stories aren't wholly wrong," I said. "I've done cold things. I nearly turned out your whole valley on a war chief's arithmetic. Don't make me kind in your reckoning, Sorcha, make me honest. It'll serve you better." And she laughed, the first time I ever heard her laugh, a short surprised sound the wind nearly took, and something in my chest that had been clenched for 12 years eased a fraction, and I thought, whatever she chooses, I will remember that I made her laugh once on the seawall, and it will have been worth the grain. The weeks between that dawn and the moon turn were the best of my life to that day, and I did not know it, because a man seldom knows the best of his life while he's inside it. She stayed through those weeks, not wed, not decided, only staying, choosing each morning to still be there, which I had asked her to do and had no right to expect and treasured past saying. And Kelvar, which is a hard house, began to change shape around her in ways too small for the great families to notice and too many for me to miss. She reckoned the hold's ledgers. I'd not asked her to. She simply found the steward drowning in them one wet afternoon and sat down, and by evening had found 3 years of a granary clerk's quiet thieving that 4 stewards had missed, and she laid it before me without triumph, only a ledger-keeper's flat distaste for a sum that didn't sum. She sat with a birthing when the Fisher Quarters midwife was 3 days off with a fever, and a breech lamb, no, I misremember. A breech child, the cooper's wife's first, came into the world alive at gray dawn because Sorcha had birthed 100 lambs, and a child is only a lamb that matters more, as she said after, wrung out and grinning, with the cooper weeping into his hands in the corner. She learned the hold stone by stone the way she'd learned it wounded. Every passage, every store, every walled-up stair my grandfather had ever forgotten, because she could not sleep, and a woman who cannot sleep walks, and a woman who walks a place enough nights knows it better than the men who were born there and never once had cause to look. And she and I talked in the dark on the sea wall and in the kennel, and in the small warm room off the hall where I did the work of ruling, talked the way I had not talked to anyone since my mother died, which is to say honestly, about small things and then about large ones. I told her of the war, the real cost of it, the wolves in the black ground above the tide line whose names I still said to myself some nights. She told me of the mill and her mother's cough, and the exact weight of being a thing that passes from hand to hand. Neither of us reached for the other. I had given her a door that opened out, and I would not so much as brush her hand until she had walked through one door or the other of her own free will. Because a king's touch is not a small thing to a woman who's been owned, and I would not have her mistake wanting to be safe for wanting me, nor be able later to wonder if I'd pressed a thumb on the scale of her choosing. Once only, she asked me a thing that came near it. You could have any she-wolf on the coast, she said. We were on the sea-wall. It was always the sea-wall late with call. Sabbath Pharaoh, if you wanted, the council would sing. Why waste a moon's grace and a landed dowry on a valley girl who might just take your land and go? And I came so close to telling her. The tide roared up in me, and the true answer was right there. Because you are mine, the moon says so. I have known it since the tally table. And it would have been the easiest thing in the world and the cruelest. And I loved her enough already, I found, to swallow the truth whole rather than hand her a lifetime of wondering whether her own heart was hers. Because Sabbath wants to be Luna of the Iron Coast, I said instead, which was also true. And you want to save a wolf no one else will touch. I've had my fill of people who want the crown, Sorcha. I never once met one who wanted the wounded thing. I looked at her. That's rarer than silver hair. That a king should not waste. She was quiet a while, then, that's not a whole answer. No, I agreed, it isn't. But it's a true part of one, and it's the part I can give you tonight. She let it lie. That was the mercy in Sorcha. She could tell when a man was keeping something back to protect her rather than himself, and she could let it lie and wait because she had a way with waiting. She thought, I learned much later, that I was keeping back some old grief, a first mate lost, a wound of my own I wasn't ready to show. She waited on it the way she'd waited on call. I let her think it. It was nearer the truth than a lie. The court read my restraint as weakness, and Sabbath read it as an opening. I should have seen the shape of it sooner. A woman who has arranged a whole hold to humiliate a rival, and watched the rival win the kennel, the below stairs, the ledgers, and, worst of all, to Sabbath's eye, the king's own quiet hours, does not simply concede the field and go home to her rich hold to sulk. She changes her weapon, and where scorn had failed against a woman too dignified to be shamed and too useful to be dismissed, Sabbath turned to the one thing that has never once failed to move a pack: fear. It began, as these things do, as talk. Just talk. A wondering over the cups in the right ears. A valley girl, low-born, with a way of getting wolves to trust her that no honest woman had. Was that not strange, now you thought on it? Call, who'd bitten every hand in the hold for 9 years, gentle as a lamb for her overnight. The whole kennel trailing her like she was their dam. Even the king hard as coast iron for 2 years, who'd sent every silver lady in the north back to her hold unwed, softened in a single season, seen sitting in the kennel at dawn, forgiving 1,100 head of grain on the strength of one plain speech. Was that a woman's kindness working on us? Or was it something worked? There are old words on the coast for a woman who can bend beasts and men alike to her hand, old and ugly words, and Sabeth was far too clever to say a single one of them herself. She only made very sure that they were there to be said, lying about like dry kindling in the right dark corners, waiting for a spark. And then Bram, my Bram, who had burned the tally at my word and never entirely forgiven me for making him do it, who read the world like a ledger and had a ledger's blind spot for the heart, found a thing he could not explain. And it was the wrong thing, at the worst hour, in the worst place. A cache of iron arrowheads, coast-forged, oiled and bundled and hidden behind loose stone in the grain store nearest the guest wing, the wing where Sorcha slept. Enough to arm a raiding party of a dozen. And wrapped around them, a scrap of oiled sailcloth, and on the sailcloth, drawn in charcoal, the wave and hook mark of the Rusk, the North Isle sea raiders who had bled the coast for a generation, whose reavers had killed the very border wolves whose price began the fen's reach debt. Bram came to me with it that evening in the small council room, grim and gray-faced, and laid it on the table between us, and behind him, reluctantly, oh so reluctantly, with a hostess's pained and dutiful sorrow arranged upon her lovely face, stood Lady Sabeth Farrow, in the doorway, present, as she had somehow contrived to be present for the finding. She came to us the same season the Rusk went quiet, Bram said, low, laying it out the way he laid out everything, fact by fact, and each fact a nail. A valley on the north road, the road the Isle men use when they come overland to scout a hold before they hit it from the sea. A girl who wanted, past all reason, past a burned debt and a rich dowry and a free road home, to be inside these walls. A girl who's charmed every wolf in the kennel so that no beast in Kelvar would raise the alarm on a dark night, who's walked every stone of this hold learning its stores and its passages and its walled-up stairs, who has the king's ear and the king's hours and the king's, he would not say heart, he said, forgiveness. He set his jaw. I hope to every ancestor in the black ground that I'm wrong, Keston. She healed call. I've eaten at a table she reckoned honest. But I'd be a traitor to you, and to the pack in the ground if I found this behind the guest wing wall and did not lay it before you. The Rusk mean to come again. Every fisher on the coast can feel it. And someone inside these walls has been opening us for them. The tide roared in me, all of it at once, higher than it had ever risen, and every drop of it said one thing. She is not this. I knew her. I had sat in the straw with her at the far end of a wolf's dying. I had watched her find a granary thief and refused to gloat over it. I had offered her a free road home and watched her, morning after morning, choose to stay in a hall that hated her. She was the least treacherous soul I had ever met, and the tide in my blood knew it past all argument. But a king cannot rule on the tide in his blood. That is the whole hard heart of ruling. If I threw the arrowheads in the fire the way I'd thrown the tally, on the strength of a feeling in my blood I could not even name aloud without giving away the bond, and if I were wrong, if there were even one chance in 100 that I were wrong, then the Rusk would come over the sea gate in the black of a moonless night, and my pack would die in their beds, having trusted a king who trusted his heart over the plain iron on his own council table. Bring her, I said, and Sabeth, since you were so very reluctantly on hand for the finding, you'll be on hand for the answering. I'll have no whisper afterward that this was judged in a corner by a king too soft on the accused. Something flickered behind Sabeth's careful sorrow, just the faintest flicker, quickly smoothed. She had not expected to be kept in the room. She had expected to light the spark and step back into the dark and let it burn on its own. But she inclined her silver head and stayed, because to refuse would have been its own confession, and Sabeth never made a confession she could avoid. They brought Sorcha to the council room. She came in her gray dress, roused from a bed she wasn't sleeping in anyway, and she looked at the arrowheads on the table, and at the rusk mark on the sailcloth, and at Bram's grim face, and at Sabeth's sorrowful one, and at mine, and I watched her understand in the space of 3 breaths and without a single word spoken, exactly what was being said of her, and exactly how neatly it had been built, and exactly how little her word would weigh against it. She did not weep. She did not throw herself into protesting, which is what the guilty do and half the innocent too. She went very still, the stillness of the wounded thing that waits, that does not thrash, because thrashing spreads the poison, and I realized with my heart in my throat that I was about to learn in front of witnesses whether the woman I had refused to let myself love out loud was the woman my whole blood believed her to be. "The wrapping's rusk," she said at last quietly into the waiting room. "The mark's right, wave and hook, that's I'll work." She stepped closer to the table, unhurried, and looked down at the arrowheads without touching them, the way she'd looked at Call's wound, seeing past the surface to the thing underneath. "But the arrows aren't. Look at the tang, the fixing stem there, where the head meets the shaft. That's a coast forge. I'll smiths hammer a square tang. Ours draw it round, always have. It's how the fisher boys tell a dropped arrow at the tide line is one of ours or one of theirs. Somebody bought a dozen coast arrowheads at a coast market and wrapped them in a scrap of rusk sail and hid them behind the wall of the store nearest the room I sleep in." She lifted her eyes and found not Bram but me, and held there, and there was no plea in them, none at all, only the ledger-keeper's flat, terrible honesty. "I did not put these here, my king. I've no way on this earth to prove it but my word, and my word is worth exactly what a valley girl's word is worth in this hall, which is nothing at all. So I'll not waste your evening swearing to you, and I'll not weep, because weeping's only what you'd expect and it proves nothing either way, a breath. But I'll ask you one thing, and I'll abide whatever you answer." "Ask," I said. My voice was not my own. "If I opened your gate for the rusk," she said slowly, "why did I do it by forgiving my own valley's debt? A traitor takes gold, my king. I'll men pay their scouts in silver and slaves. Everyone on the coast knows it. I took a burned tally that put me deeper in your debt, not out of it, and a court that despises me, and a bed I could have left free and landed any day these past weeks. You offered me the door yourself, before witnesses. What kind of rusk spy begs to stay in the hold she means to betray, when the king's own hand is holding the door open and pointing at the road home? She let it sit. Treason that costs the traitor everything and pays her nothing isn't treason. It's just a story somebody built about a woman they wanted gone, and built well, I'll grant them, but built for a hall that wants to believe it, not for a king who'll do the arithmetic." Do the arithmetic. She had thrown Bram's own coin back across the table, and Bram, my honest, cold, ledger-reading war chief, heard it land. And I watched the doubt enter him because it was arithmetic and it did not sum, and Bram could no more ignore a sum that didn't sum than he could stop breathing. And in the doorway, Sabeth's careful sorrow slipped just a hair, just at the corner of her lovely mouth, a small tightening of impatience that this was not going the clean way she'd built it to go. It lasted less than a heartbeat, but I saw it. And Bram, who missed nothing, saw me see it and turned his head, and saw the last of it fade from Sabeth's face, and I watched my war chief begin, at last, to do a different arithmetic entirely. "Who set you looking behind that wall, Bram?" Sorcha asked. She did not raise her voice. She asked it as gently as she'd asked Call to let her near the wound. "You didn't go hunting rusk sailcloth in a grain store on a whim tonight. You're a careful man, you don't tear out a wall on a fancy. Someone told you it wanted checking. Someone worried. Someone helpful." Bram Halloran went pale. He said nothing for a long moment. He did not need to. His silence, and the slow turn of his head back toward the doorway where Sabeth stood, was answer enough for every wolf in the room. He had not gone hunting arrowheads on his own account. Someone had come to him, reluctant, dutiful, worried for the king's safety, wondering aloud whether the guest wing store had been checked lately, with all these Rusk rumors about and a stranger sleeping so near. Someone standing in the doorway even now, with the last of a slip still fading from the corner of her mouth. I did not shout. I have found in 12 years of ruling that the quietest voice is the one a hall remembers longest, and that a king who roars has already lost the part of himself that frightens the wolf who should be frightened. "Lady Sabeth," I said, and I said it very softly, and the whole room leaned in to hear it. "You'll bide in the hold under my watch and not leave it until I've had every coast smith between here and the North Road tell me whose forge cut these tangs and who bought a dozen arrowheads off him, and when. Round tangs," the lady said. "My fisher boys will know the market and the maker inside a week." I let that settle on her. "And if the iron comes back Kelvar forged, bought and dressed as Raider's kit to hang an innocent woman and blind me to the real danger while you did it, then it is not Sorcha of Fen's Reach who has opened my house to my enemies. It's you, by trying to make me kill, with my own hand and my own doubt, the one soul in this hold worth the keeping." Sabeth opened her mouth. She was quick. She would have had something, some wounded, elegant denial, but I had already turned from her, because a king need not watch the face of someone he has finished with, and the turning of a king's back is its own sentence, and every wolf in the hall understood it as one. "Bram," he straightened. Whatever shame he felt at having carried Sabeth's spark into my council room, he was still my war chief, and there was work. "Double the Seagate watch tonight, triple it tomorrow, and send word down to the Fisher Quarter for their eyes on the water." I met his eyes. Because whoever went to this much trouble, Coast Iron dressed as Isle Kit, a spy invented out of a valley girl, my own war chief made the finder of it, went to that trouble for one reason, Bram. To have us all looking inward at each other, at a woman in a gray dress, on the very nights we most needed to be looking out. Someone wanted Kelvar blind. And the only people who want to hold blind are the people who mean to come at it in the dark. Bram's face changed, the ledgerman doing the last, cold some and hating the answer. "The Rusk are coming," he said. "Soon." "Soon," I agreed, "and now we're looking the right way." They came that night. They came the way the Rusk always came. No horns, no torches, oars muffled in oiled rag, the low black boats sliding up under the cliffs on the ebb tide while the moon was down, and the wind was off the land to carry no sound of them ashore. And the false accusation had already done half their work for them, exactly as it was meant to. Half the hold had spent the day whispering about a valley witch and a Rusk spy. Half my wolves had gone to their rest with their minds turned inward on suspicion and each other. And a hold that has spent a day looking at itself is slow, so slow, to look out at the water. If the Seagate watch had been its ordinary size, they'd have been over the low wall and into the sleeping guest wing before a single wolf woke. They'd have taken the nursery passage, where the hold's little ones slept, and the Fisher Quarter's children brought up for safety on rumor of a raid, and they'd have done what the Rusk do, and Kelvar would have woken to a grief it would not have survived whole. But I had doubled the watch, and then tripled it, on the strength of a valley girl's arithmetic and a slip at the corner of Sabeth Pharaoh's mouth. And so the reavers came up out of the black water and met wolves at the Seagate instead of children in their beds. I remember the fight in pieces, the way you remember any real fight, not as a story but as a handful of hard, bright fragments. The cold spray coming over the wall. The first grunt and clash as the watch met them at the gate, and the alarm went up at last, too late to be a surprise and just in time to be a defense. Bram beside me, roaring the hold awake, his blade already dark. The shudder of the old iron-bound gate as the Isle men threw themselves against it in a mass, trying to carry it by weight before we could set our feet. And under it all, the good, clean, terrible joy of it, the joy no king admits to and every wolf knows, of standing on your own ground in the dark, with your teeth bared, between your enemy and your own. We held the gate. That was never truly in doubt once the alarm was up. The Rusk are fierce but few. A raiding party is not an army, and they had wagered everything on coming in silent and finding us blind, and we were neither. We held the gate, and we began to turn them, and I remember thinking in the middle of it, with a reaver's blood on my arm and my wolf singing in my blood, I remember thinking with relief that Sorcha was safe, far from the water. In the guest wing, well back from the gate, safe. I was wrong about that. I had been wrong about so many things, the tally, the mercy, the danger, the shape of Sabbath's smile. But I was never so nearly ruined by being wrong as I was by that. Because the Rusk are not fools either, and they had not staked everything on the sea gate. While the loud attack broke and bled against my wall, a second boat had gone quiet along the base of the cliff to the east, to a place the Isle men should never have known of, the old sea stair, the crumbling flight of steps my grandfather had walled off and abandoned 2 generations gone, that led up out of the rock beside the very nursery passage where the children slept. Every soul in Kelvar had forgotten that stair. Every soul but one. A woman who rose before the kitchens and could not sleep, and had walked every stone of the hold in the dark until she knew it better than the men born in it. A woman who, the very moment the alarm went up, did not run to safety and did not freeze. She ran to the children. Sorcha reached the nursery passage to move the little ones up to the high tower, away from the gate and the fighting, with 2 terrified nursemaids and a dozen sleeping infants gathered in her arms and theirs. And she came around the last turn of the passage with a lamp held high, and found the old sea stair open, and 6 armed reavers coming up out of the black of it toward the children. She did not run, my steadfast, waiting, unbreakable woman. She had one instant to choose, with the sea raider's torch eyes fixing on the lamp and the soft huddle behind it, and she chose the way she chose everything, without noise, without waste, and without the smallest thought for herself. She threw the lamp. Not at the men, past them, down onto the wet stone of the stair's mouth, where the oil burst and caught and threw up a wall of flame across a narrow passage where fire could go nowhere and burn nothing but the men trying to climb through it. And in the light and the roar and the sudden screaming of scorched reavers, she snatched from the passage wall the one weapon there, old Farron's boar spear, kept by the kennel door these 30 years, and she set herself in the narrow gap of the passage, one woman in a gray dress with a hunting spear between 6 sea raiders and a dozen sleeping children, and she held the stair. She held it, bleeding. A reaver's axe had come round the fire and found her forearm before the flames drove him back screaming. She held the narrow stone throat of that passage with a spear she'd never raised in anger in her life, jabbing and shouting the children's tower ward names to the sobbing nursemaids over her shoulder, buying with her own body the only thing that ever mattered, which was time. She held it long enough. That is the whole of it, and it is everything I have. She held it until Bram and I and 8 of the pack, turning from a gate that no longer needed us, came down the nursery passage at a dead run with the firelight leaping ahead of us on the walls. And by the time we reached her, the fire had cost the reavers their nerve and their footing on the wet steps, and we finished them there in the narrow dark, on the stair the Isle men should never have found, and gave the rest to the sea. And then it was over, and the passage was full of smoke, and the crying of frightened children being carried up to safety, and I found her against the wall. She was still on her feet. The spear was still in her 2 hands, its point down now, as if she could not quite make her fingers let go of it. There was a long red wound down her left forearm where the axe had bitten, dark and running, and she was gray as her dress, grayer, the color a strong soul goes when it has spent everything it had and is only now in the after-quiet finding out how much that was. The children were crying safe, being carried up the tower stair behind her. And when she saw through the smoke that it was me, she did not say help, and she did not say I'm hurt. She said, and I will hear it in my heart until the day they put me in the black ground above the tide line, she said. The children are up, I got them all up. As if that were the only column in the whole night's tally that needed adding. As if her own blood, running off her fingertips onto my grandfather's forgotten stair, were an unimportant figure she had not troubled to reckon, because it did not bear on the only sum that mattered. I went down on my knees on the wet stone in front of her. I, the Alpha King of the Iron Coast, went to my knees in the smoke and the blood of my own hold, and I took her wounded arm in both my hands to staunch the bleeding of it. And where my hands closed over the wound, over her blood and mine mingling on her torn gray sleeve, the mark rose. I had felt the bond since her first word in my hall 2 moons before. But the mate mark, the moon's own seal, the silver-blue sign that comes only when the bond is met and answered, when the tie of fate has been made true by choice on both sides, when 2 wolves have chosen each other in the marrow and not only been bound by the moon. The mate mark does not rise for a woman who stays out of duty or fear or gratitude or a debt. It rises only for chosen. And it rose now, under my palm, cool as sea fire and the exact deep blue of the water at the ebb, blooming out of her own skin at the edge of the wound, and spreading up her wrist, and up across the back of my own hand where it held her, to meet its other half, the 2 broken pieces of 1 moon mark finding each other across 38 winters of my waiting and a lifetime of hers, and closing and shining whole. She felt it rise. She looked down at our joined hands, at the light coming up out of her own torn skin to answer the light in mine, and then she looked at me, and the ledger-keeper's steadiness, that had held through scorn and accusation and 6 armed men on a burning stair, finally, wholly, gave way. "What is that?" she whispered. "Keston. What is that?" "It's you," I said, the same word I had given her twice before, on the sea wall and in the hall, and this time all of it, the whole withheld truth of it, came with the word at last. "It's what I felt the very moment you spoke in my hall and said we can pay. You're my fated mate, Sorcha. The moon bound me to you before I knew your name, before I saw your face clear. I felt the whole sea turn over inside me when you said it, and I have known, every day since, past all doubting." My voice broke and I let it. "I didn't tell you. I couldn't tell you, and I need you to understand why, before you decide what to do with a man who kept it from you. If I'd told you, then every kind thing you ever felt for me after would have been poisoned. You'd have spent your whole life wondering, did I stay for him, or did the bond make me? Do I love him, or does the tide in my blood only wear the mask of love? I watched that question drive a good woman in my own house to her grave. And you had already been passed like a chair and priced like a debt, and nearly sold to a man who didn't mark his dead. I could not, be one more force in your life pushing you toward a thing you'd never freely chosen." I pressed her marked hand between both of mine. "So I gave you the door instead, the one that opened out. And I watched you every single morning choose to still be here, choose it free, knowing you could go landed and rich and owned by no one, and it was the hardest thing I have ever done in a life that has held a war, and it was the best." I looked at the mark shining whole across our 2 hands. "And it would not have risen, Sorcha. Do you understand? The mark does not rise for fate. It never has. It rises only for chosen. It could not have risen tonight if you had only been fated to me. It rose because you chose me. Somewhere in these 2 moons, on that sea wall or in that cold kennel, freely and owing me nothing and fearing me not at all, you chose me back." She was quiet a long moment, bleeding and shaking and alive, the firelight dying to embers on the walls around us, and the children's crying fading up the tower stair to safety. "You gave me a door that opened out," she said slowly, working it through in the way she worked through everything, "so that I could be certain, sure past any wondering for the whole rest of my life, that the staying was mine, that I did it, not fate, not fear, me." "Yes," I said, "that's all. That's the whole of it that I couldn't say till now." And then she laughed, a wet, broken, furious, wonderful laugh, the second time I ever heard her laugh, and worth more than the grain, worth more than the crown, and she said through the tears and the blood and the smoke, "You impossible man, you stubborn, kingly, impossible man, I chose you weeks ago. I chose you the morning on the sea wall, the very hour you told me I could go. That was the hour I knew I never would." She gripped my hands hard, mark to mark. "You gave me a door that opened out. I've been standing in it every day since, looking back in at you, wondering why in the name of the moon you couldn't see me not walking through it. I claimed her before the whole court a fortnight later, when the wound on her arm had closed clean under her own doctoring, and the mark above it had settled to a steady silver blue, and I did it kneeling. There was talk of it afterward that a king ought not kneel, that a crown does not bow to a valley miller's daughter, that it looked ill and soft before the great families and the watching coast. Let them talk. It is talked of still, up and down the iron coast, and I have never once minded. I have knelt to three things in the whole of my life: my father's grave, my mother's grave, and this one living woman. And I would kneel to her again tomorrow in front of every lord on the northern water, which is very nearly what I did. I had the great hall filled, the council, the great families' pharaoh chair conspicuously empty, the whole pack, wolves and men, with old Call lying across the dais steps where he'd taken to lying whenever Sorcha was in a room, and in the very front, where I set them with my own hand, the 7 farmers and the old headman of Fenn's Reach, brought back to Kelvar at my cost, and my insistence to see the end of the story they had watched begin at a tally table 2 moons gone. The old headman wore the same battered hat. He turned it round and round in his hands the whole while. Sabbath I had already sent north, for the coast smiths had answered as plainly as Sorcha said they would, round-tanged coast iron every one, sold by a Kelvar smith to a factor who traced back, through 3 careful hands, to Pharaoh silver. I did not kill her. I am not a killer of women who have already lost everything they schemed for, and Sorcha, when I asked her what justice she'd have, had said only, "Send her somewhere she can't poison anything living, and let that be the whole of it. A life spent small is punishment enough for a woman who wanted to be Luna." So I stripped Sabbath of her whole stewardship and settled her, landed but powerless and far from any court she could work on a windward stretch of the far north coast, to live out her days as small as she had tried to make Sorcha, which was, as my Luna said, the whole of it. I stood Sorcha in the center of the filled hall in a gown that was not gray, deep sea blue, the exact color the mark had risen, with the healed white line of the wound bare on her forearm, and the silver blue mark bare above it for every wolf in that room to see, and to know for what it was. 2 moons ago, I said, and I pitched it so the whole hall and the farmers in the front and the wolves at the back could hear every word. A woman walked into this room that my war chief wanted to turn out into the snow, and this court wanted to laugh at below the salt, and I let it land honestly because she taught me that I wanted to send home, and I told myself it was mercy. The truth was that I did not trust that anything so good could be mine to keep, and it is easier to give a good thing away than to stand the fear of losing it. Bram, at my right, inclined his head and took his own share of it openly, as the honest man he was and is. I had made him grovel not at all. He had come to Sorcha of his own accord the morning after the stair, and knelt in the kennel where she sat with Call and asked her pardon plainly for the arrowheads and the doubt, and she had given it plainly, and they have been the 2 who understand my hold best between them ever since. The ledger and the waiting, arm in arm. She offered to spend herself to spare her people from the snow, I said. She healed the wolf no healer would touch. She found a thief 4 stewards missed. She birthed a child at gray dawn when the midwife was 3 days off. And when the rusk came up a stair the rest of us had forgotten for 2 generations, she stood in a gray dress with a kennel spear and held that stair with her own blood, so that every child in this hold woke the next morning to their mothers instead of to grief. I let my eyes travel the hall, family by family. And every one of you who called her low-born, or strange, or worse, who let a lie about a valley which grow in the corners of this house, because it was easier than being shamed by her worth. Every one of you was looking at the finest and truest heart in this hold, and calling it a debt. The hall was silent. The old headman had stopped turning his hat. He was weeping again, without shame, an old man who had walked his village's daughter into a monster's hall, and lived to watch her stand at its heart in sea blue. I turned to Sorcha, and I went down on one knee before her on the stone of my own dais, and I took her marked hand in my marked one, and I turned them so that the two halves of the moon's seal met and shone whole for the whole court to witness. I will not name you my Luna because you saved us, I said, low now, half for the hall and half only for her. You'd hate that, and you'd be right too. It would be a bill I paid you for the stare, and you have never once in your life let a thing you did out of love be reckoned as a debt owed back. So I'll not do it that way. I drew a breath. I name you my Luna because you are my fated mate, and having been given every door in the world to walk out of, having been offered land and freedom and a road home where you owed no man and feared no man, you stayed. You chose this cold hall and this hard king and this ungrateful court, freely, owing nothing, fearing nothing. The mark on our hands is the moon's own witness that no fate made you do it. You did it. I looked up at her. So here is the last choice I will ever ask you to make in front of anyone, Sorcha of Fen's reach, and then I'll ask you to make your choices in private like a queen for the rest of our lives. Wed me, not to spare your village it's long spared, not for the debt it's ash 2 moons cold, not because the pack watched you hold a stare. For no reason on the whole earth or under the whole moon, but that you want to. The old headman held his breath. The whole hall held it. Call lifted his gray head off the dais steps. Yes, Sorcha said. And then, because she was who she was and would be Luna of the Iron Coast on exactly her own terms or not at all, she said it again, louder, pitched clear to the very back of the hall, to the wolves and the great families and the weeping farmers and the empty pharaoh chair. Yes, and now get up off that cold stone, Keston Dunmer. My people came 4 days over the winter road to see you standing beside me, not kneeling in front of me. Stand up and let them see, their girl's got a king who stands at her shoulder. So I stood, and the pack bowed. I never gave the word I want that known, and it is known. I did not command it. But a hall full of wolves had watched a plain woman in a gray dress hold their children stare with her own blood, and there is a thing wolves know in their bones that no court can teach them and no crown can command, and it went through that great room like the tide coming in over the flats, unstoppable, and from the sea itself. Bram bowed first, deep, then the pack. Then the great families, some quick and easy, some slow and stiff. And slow or quick I marked every one of them, not for vengeance, but because a king should always know exactly who was slow to honor the best thing that ever came into his house. And old Call heaved himself up off the dais steps and crossed to her and leaned his whole gray weight against her side, and Sorcha put her marked hand down into his ruff, where it had first gone in a cold kennel 2 moons before, and that, the old wolf leaning on her, and her hand in his fur, and the whole hall down in its bow around them. That was the truest crowning of the two. We were wed at the next full moon, on the cliff head above the tide line where my line has always married and always buried its dead, the black rock underfoot, and the gray sea throwing itself white against it far below, the wind carrying the salt up over us the way it has carried the salt over every wolf of my blood who ever swore a vow on that ground. And Fen's reach planted in the spring and the spring after and every spring since, and its mill turns again, for I had the wheel that the flood took rebuilt out of my own hand and my own purse, and I did not tell her, and I let her find it herself. We rode there that first summer, she and I, down the winter road her people had walked, in green weather now. And she came into the mill yard where her mother had worked before the water took the wheel, and the wheel took the living, and the living took her mother. And she saw the great new wheel turning in the race, throwing its bright rope of water, and she stopped, and she did not say one word for a long, long time. She only stood in the yard of the valley that once had nothing, home now as its Luna, and reached out and took my hand, and held it very hard, mark against mark. That is the picture I keep, not the kneeling in the great hall, though they still tell that tale the length of the coast and will, I think, long after I am in the black ground. Not the burning stair, though I climb it once a year on the night of it, and set a single lit lamp on its top step and stand a while in the dark listening to the sea, and say the children's names, all 12, that woke to their mothers. What I keep past all of it is Sorcha in the mill yard in the green summer weather, home and safe and no man's chair and no man's debt, her marked hand crushing mine and no words at all coming out of her, because some tallies run too full ever to add, and the best of them a wise soul never tries to finish. You only go on paying them, gladly, every ordinary day of your life. Which is what I have done since, and mean to do until the sea takes me, and count myself, for a king who once expected the getting of nothing, the richest man on the whole iron coast.